Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 20th of May. I'm Robert Barwick. This week's CEC Report is a special edition. It's been recorded slightly later than normal because the CEC has just completed its 2013 National Conference, which was entitled Towards a Nobler Manhood and a National Credit System. Now, some of the presentations at our conference were on Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa and the Australian poet Charles Harper, and both of those people have featured in special editions of the CEC Report in the past. In this week's CEC Report, though, we're going to have 3 interviews with special guests who are at our conference. And my first guest is Joanne McAndrews, who has visited our conference from the United States, where Joe is on the front line of the fight for Glass-Steagall, and Joe came down to Australia to present at our national conference. So welcome, Joe.
Thanks.
All right. Joanne, you've got some good news on the Glass-Steagall fight. We've just had a significant breakthrough, haven't we?
Yes. You've just had, we already had a bill introduced into the House of Representatives that's been in there since January, since the beginning of this Congress. But we've finally got a bill introduced into the US Senate, which is a major step forward. It's Senate Bill 985. And this was actually introduced on the 80th anniversary of the original Glass-Steagall being introduced into Congress back in 1933.
And this is by Senator Tom Harkin who
Yes.
introduced this bill.
Yes, Senator Tom Harkin. He's a Democrat from Iowa.
And this breakthrough has followed hot on the heels of a special week of action that the LaRouche forces in the US have just undertaken there in Washington.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot in Congress. We've had several smaller weeks of action, but May 6th through 10th we had a nationwide week of action to really kind of push things over the edge with the intention, one, of getting more co-sponsors on the House resolution, but also, most importantly, to actually get something finally introduced into the Senate. So we had, I think it was something around 60 or 70 people came into Washington, D.C. from all kinds of states, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Florida, probably some people from Connecticut, and we had them on the ground in D.C. for a full week. There was something like 50 meetings that took place with congressional offices, and over a quarter of those were actually with senators and representatives directly.
And what was unusual that I noticed is that this week of action got a fair amount of media publicity.
Yeah, you had actually in Washington D.C. in one of the newspapers there was a whole article written before the week of action even began, saying that there was going to be a mobilization. Yeah, we got a lot of other support through Twitter and Facebook and things like that, where people were actually reposting about the week of action and encouraging people to participate.
So is it your sense that this question of Glass-Steagall is getting very broad-based support in the United States?
Absolutely, and a lot of that's through the work that we've done in the state legislatures as a way to put the pressure onto Congress itself. Because Congress is under so much pressure from Wall Street and the City of London to go with other things like the Dodd-Frank, the Volcker rule. Now you've got the Brown-Vitter legislation. So the key was that you had to go to the grassroots of the nation and actually build up the pressure from there to force Congress into having no choice but actually, signing onto this legislation.
How does Glass-Steagall, let me just say this, we've got a lot of regular viewers of the CEC Report, but for those who might have been tuning in for the first time or just recently, just give them a sense of what Glass-Steagall is, especially in comparison to things like Dodd-Frank, which is probably more well known. And how do American legislators respond to their understanding of it?
Well, I think the most obvious thing is that the Glass-Steagall would actually go into place immediately. One of the worst parts about Dodd-Frank and now the Brown-Vitter, and I mean, they're saying, in 10 years' time or in 15 years' time, or here's our suggestions of what you should, as an honorable bank, do if you're going to be good to the American people.
Here's our solution to the current crisis. Let's do this in a decade.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas Glass-Steagall just simply says, look, we have to put a firewall in place to stop this financial collapse from going any further, separating your commercial and your investment banks so that the investment banks, in the end, it's just simply the fact that these guys won't be bailed out by the FDIC. Their investments won't be insured because they're not a commercial bank. And you can't get your fingers on the savings accounts of the average American citizens. But once that's in place, I mean, and this is one of the points Mr. LaRouche has been making now is, look, we've got to get people to think beyond a simple banking separation mechanism and actually get to the issues of a credit system, which Glass-Steagall is just the first step in.
Yeah, because LaRouche often talks about the Glass-Steagall principle, which is much bigger than Glass-Steagall.
Yes.
It's this idea that you're not just protecting something, you're protecting a function of the economy.
Yes. And the key thing is Glass-Steagall came in after Roosevelt had done the banking reorganization. Right, the reorganization happened first, where they went in, cleaned out the bank accounts, wrote off a lot of the speculative debts, reinvested in the banks, and actually got them all open again. So Glass-Steagall was kind of the afterthought to actually then legislate for history what the principles should be of the banking system. So yeah, it's a step in a much larger process of actually putting the nation back to work, actually funding your national infrastructure, your internal improvement programs. And just reestablishing a system that is based on the powers of labor and the physical wealth, not speculation.
Now, you gave a presentation at our conference on the American system precedent for national banking, and we talked about Australia's tradition of national banking with the Commonwealth Bank. It came directly from the United States, and you took it all the way back to the original settling of the US in the 1600s. So just speak briefly on that, if you will, to explain this question of physical economy and development in the context of Glass-Steagall.
Okay, that's a big one.
No pressure.
No pressure. Well, yeah, I mean, it came, and this was part of the other panels of the conference, the work on CUSA and the question of the fight historically to create a nation state where you view man as a creative individual, that all men are created equal. And so the basis of the development of America started long before the American Revolution, long before the Constitution, and you can trace it back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony of the 1630s, where they came to America with a self-charter, which was unprecedented, to actually say, okay, we're going to establish a new world, we're going to create a new system of government where we can actually uphold the greatest concepts of man and actually embed them in a government system.
And those early guys consciously took charge of the money system to make sure that the physical development was able to happen.
Yes, they refused to just be subservient to England and wait for them to send them specie so that they had some means of exchange of their labor. They said no, and they minted their own coin in 1652, the pine tree shilling, and then began experimenting with the question of credit, to remove the system from being about how much gold or silver you have in your possession to being, okay, how valuable are you to the development of society? What can you give to the community? What is your powers of labor?
And so what they were able to demonstrate, which you highlighted in the later on in the Declaration of Independence, is that the economy had to meet the needs of the people in terms that the Declaration of Independence described that people had real rights, but it's one thing to say that. You had to have an economic system that could deliver on those rights.
Yes, and this is some of the stuff we went through on Hamilton around the Revolutionary War, because once the US declared its independence and they created the Continental Congress, but you had 13 different states. Those 13 states had their own, form of government within their own state. So the question was, well, how do you actually bring those 13 states together as a whole and fight for the benefit of everyone versus having a state say, well, we're just interested in ourselves, we're going to do what benefits us, but if it doesn't benefit you, well, then that's bad luck. And this is where the first Bank of North America came about, which was the first, big example of the credit system in the United States, and that's how they funded the American Revolution.
Yeah. All right, well, Joanne, thank you very much for that. Joanne's presentation to the CEC National Conference will be available soon, but people can call into the CEC and order copies of it. When it is available, we'll also put it up on YouTube. So I urge everyone who's a regular viewer of the CEC Report to look out for that presentation, because it was an exceptional presentation on this historical background to the ideas that we're fighting for in Australia today. So, Joanne, again, thank you very much. The viewers may or may not have been able to tell by your dodgy accent that you actually are an Australian who is revisiting us, so we appreciate that, and we'll have to leave it there. When we come back, we're going to talk to a special guest from Ireland. Welcome back to the CEC Report. We're joined now by a special guest to our conference, Jean Douglas from the LaRouche Irish Brigade, all the way from Ireland. Welcome, Jean.
Thanks, Robbie.
Jean, I wanted to ask you further about some of the things you said to our conference in the remarks you made, where you painted a pretty stark picture about the state of the Irish economy. We have covered the island situation a lot for the last few years, and in fact it featured on the front page of our New Citizen newspaper when it all blew up. So you live there. What is the situation in Ireland with the economic crisis and the austerity there?
Well, the situation is quite bad. The economy is in extremely poor shape, I would say. We have a huge level of unemployment, especially youth unemployment. I think it's in excess of 40%. And that is despite the fact that we have this traditional safety valve of immigration. That
you mean people leaving Ireland?
Immigration, yeah, people leaving Ireland. And that, as I said, that's been a traditional feature of Irish life, for centuries. But I think at the minute it has reached like almost unprecedented peaks. So in
what sort of numbers are we talking about?
Well, in the last 2 years, just the past 2 years, there have been more than 300,000 people have left the country. And just to put it in perspective, the population of Ireland is quite small. It's roughly something equivalent to the size of Melbourne, maybe a million more, but around 5 million. So
300,000 people leaving that is a big deal.
And it's the youth that are leaving. It's the future of the country that are leaving because there is no prospect in their mind, for a future for them. At home, it's very, tragic circumstances.
And we're speaking in Australia now. A lot of Irish people come to Australia, and we're happy to have Irish people. It's been our tradition for 200 years anyway. Yes. That's not the issue. The issue I'm interested in, given that there's still 40% youth unemployment in Ireland, despite this exodus, what do you see socially? Do you see a lot of aimless young people with, getting into trouble?
You do. You see a lot of that. You see a lot of alcohol abuse. Is quite widespread, but also the impact of drugs is very worrying. Traditionally, Ireland has managed to resist pretty well. The whole drugs problem, but that is they're beginning to flow through, and when you see drug use in small remote villages, in Ireland, and towns and villages where you normally, 5-10 years ago, you wouldn't have seen it.
So Jean, from what I understand, the economic crisis in Ireland came as, it's been very sharp and very severe. What was it like, though, living in the so-called boom in Ireland before all this happened? Did you see the writing on the wall?
Yeah, I think the writing on the wall was there for some time, ahead of the actual crash. What you had was, just a property bubble, which was just, increasing at a massive rate. For example, in the sort of 3, 4, 5 years ahead of the crash, property prices were increasing really across the board by about 30% per year. And so if you look at the overall sort of wage increases in that same period, which were less than 4%, I think it was it was clear to anybody that just considered those facts that it was bound to collapse, and collapse in a dramatic way.
Well, and I'm asking you that because that's very relevant to Australia. We've had the same property phenomenon, except ours hasn't collapsed because a lot of effort's been put into propping it up. But yours, it did in Ireland, and of course the Irish government was, in a sense, threatened or cajoled into going with this pretty vicious austerity program. You're now the leader of a political movement there, the LaRouche Irish Brigade. What are you pushing for, and what have you been doing recently to achieve that?
Well, our main focus is on trying to promote basically the LaRouche rescue plan, if you like, the 3-point plan of firstly Glass-Steagall, followed by a credit system, and also infrastructure development. So that is the plan that I think that applies universally. It's the essential plan, it's the only feasible plan that will work. So we have been trying to promote those ideas, and particularly Glass-Steagall is the first necessary breakthrough. And I think we've had a measure of success in doing that. It's been difficult because Glass-Steagall isn't recognised, historically in Ireland. But as I say, we keep working at it and hope to achieve the breakthrough. But I think the essential breakthrough has to come in the US itself.
Yep. But America, developments in America are paid close attention to in Ireland, aren't they? Because there is such a close relationship between the two countries.
Yes, I mean, traditionally there has been. You have a big Irish-American population. I think it's estimated something like 55 million people. So, so I mean, there should be a little bit of, influence in each direction. So,
well, it'd be good to see America pass Glass-Steagall. We just talked in the previous segment about it being tabled in the Senate now, and the significance of that. It's the actual Glass-Steagall bill revived, and if that does pass, a lot of countries will line up to copy it quite quickly.
Yes, I think they will fall into line immediately. Yeah.
Well, listen, Gene, thanks very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
We're running out of time for this segment, unfortunately. So when we come back, we're going to talk to our WA State Secretary, Gene Robinson, for an update on the Western Australian farm crisis. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So finally, our last special guest is the Western Australian State Secretary of the CEC, Gene Robinson. Welcome, Gene.
Welcome, Robbie. It's good to be here.
We're very good to have you. Now, Gene, you've been in a bit of hand-to-hand combat over there in the West on the question of this farm crisis, which is really severe. Tell us a bit what it's like and what you've done over there.
Well, it is severe. It's actually tragic because the crisis is continuing. And, it all sort of came to a head with a huge crisis meeting and that. But the crisis meetings are always orchestrated, and this is what they do to try and get the farmers to vent their spleen. But unfortunately what happens is actually very demoralising for the farmers.
And so you went along to make it not demoralising and got suppressed, basically.
Yeah, because, we were there to offer the solutions as we've been doing in Western Australia for the last 20 years. And the usual thing happens. The Liberal political parties and the establishment have already got their different ideas of what they're going to do. But basically what's happened is you've got some farmers that are obviously able to put their crops in, but you've got 30% basically they can't do anything. So who knows what's happening with them, because now the media's moved on and it's like, everything's back to usual, oh, it's raining. But it's actually not raining. It's actually very, very dry, minimal rainfall. So of course that adds to the crisis even more.
So we're the ones that are keeping the issue alive.
Absolutely. And that's what has to happen, because unless there is an intervention and a change in policy very rapidly, which of course can be done in an instant, as we laid out in that crisis meeting, the government can act tomorrow to actually solve this problem and save our food supply. This is what's at stake. Yeah.
Well, just on that, let's now pause for a second. Gene, you've just recorded 2 radio advertisements that I believe start today,
yes.
Monday the 20th of May, for radio in rural Western Australia. So just listen to Gene on these 2 ads. They go for 30 seconds each.
I'm Jean Robinson, Citizens Electoral Council candidate for O'Connor. We must save our precious food production from the banks and politicians who are destroying our family farmers. The government saved the banks, it can save the farmers. I demand a moratorium on all farm foreclosures and government credit to keep the farmers producing. To join this fight, call 1800 636 432, spoken and authorised by J. Robinson from the Citizens Electoral Council, Kojonup. I'm Jean Robinson, Citizens Electoral Council candidate for O'Connor. The farm crisis shows that Australia urgently needs a Glass-Steagall separation of banking services from financial gambling. While speculating like crazy, the banks refuse to extend credit to our farmers. The government must enact the Glass-Steagall to ensure credit for family farms. To join this fight, call 1800 636 432, spoken and authorised by Jean Robinson for the Citizens Electoral Council, Kojonup.
All right, so in there, you're laying out very clearly that the government can act now to stop this crisis, as you said.
Absolutely, because it's, the Glass-Steagall has to be implemented at a worldwide level and here in Australia. Without that, nobody's going to survive this crash, because that's what's happened. The whole system's crashing.
And the principle of Glass-Steagall is that the reason to have a Glass-Steagall is to protect the essential part of the financial system. And if credit to farmers to grow food is not essential, nothing is.
Exactly, and it's ironic actually, because we're trying to save the banks from themselves actually.
Yeah.
And also because we have this policy of genocide of destroying food production, and it's happening, at a very increased rate of collapse, and unless there is a substantial intervention by the government, who has the authority to do that, we are going to see complete devastation.
Well, Jean, apart from YouTube, our CEC report is on television on Channel 31 in capital cities. And of course, the majority of the Australian population live in capital cities, and as you said, the media sometimes reports this and then they move on to another subject. You live in the rural area, and the point on what you said about the policy against food supply is this crisis is not the beginning of it. You've witnessed personally a massive depopulation of rural Western Australia for a long time, haven't you?
Oh, absolutely. I went to the first crisis meeting in 1992 actually, because we were in the pig industry, and virtually all the pig farmers turned up, but it was the same process. So they're all just talk fests, everybody goes home, and the destruction continues. The British free trade policies continue in the market economy, which is the causality of the problem anyway. So we've had this for 20 years now, and but the problem is the population, the rural population, are so subservient to believing in the media and believing in the so-called political parties, which are actually just representatives of the bankers. So consequently, they need to wake up very soon. Otherwise, we're not going to have anything, because it's not just the farmers, it's the communities, it's the schools, it's the hospitals, it's everything. It's becoming so severe that people can't even get their children educated anymore. I know families are thinking about employing tutors, getting together, employing tutors to actually educate their children, because there's no schools left.
This is Australia in the 21st century.
Yes, this is
all right, well,
ridiculous.
Well, Jean, thanks very much for that picture. Jean is the CEC candidate for the seat of O'Connor in this coming federal election, so that the people will have someone to vote for. But we've run out of time, so thanks for tuning in. Tune in next week for more CEC Report.